The glass walls of the conference room stretched floor to ceiling, framing the city skyline like a living painting. Sunlight poured through in golden streaks, catching the polished edges of the mahogany table, the gleam of crystal glasses, and the hard shine of wealth that seemed to sit heavy in the air. Every detail of the room whispered power: leather chairs, silver trays, the faint aroma of imported coffee. It was the kind of space built not just for meetings, but for declarations. And at the center of it all was Richard Vale. He walked in like he owned not just the building, but the city itself. His entourage followed a step behind, assistants with clipboards, a publicist clutching her phone, a bodyguard who looked like he'd been carved out of stone. Richard's suit was immaculate, his watch gleaming with the kind of quiet arrogance that said it wasn't for telling time, it was for telling status. He scanned the room as though he were surveying a kingdom, and his eyes quickly landed on a man standing near the refreshments table. David Cole. He stood there in a dark, tailored suit that fit his frame with understated elegance. No flashy accessories, no attempt to draw attention. He poured himself a glass of water with the kind of calm, deliberate motion that made everything else in the room feel hurried. His posture was upright, his eyes thoughtful, and his presence, though quiet, was undeniable. Yet to Richard, who judged men by the glitter of their cufflinks and the names on their Rolodex, David was invisible in the worst way. Richard strode across the room, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. He extended his hand halfway, then paused, his eyes narrowing. Something in him shifted, a calculation, a judgment, and in that instant, he decided. David had turned, offering his hand with a courteous smile, the kind of smile born of respect, not deference. But Richard didn't take it. Instead, with a dismissive wave of his palm, he let his hand drop back to his side. His voice cut through the room, sharp and dripping with arrogance. "I don't shake hands with staff." For a moment, the room seemed to stop breathing. The words hung in the air, heavy and awkward, settling like dust on every corner of the glass chamber. A few heads turned, some eyes widened, others quickly darted away, pretending they hadn't heard. But everyone had. David didn't flinch. His hand lowered slowly, gracefully, as if the refusal hadn't cut him at all. His eyes met Richard's, not with anger, not with shame, but with something far more disarming: calm. That steady kind of calm that unsettled men who thrived on dominance. He simply gave a small nod, a polite acknowledgement, and then turned his gaze back to the city skyline, as if Richard Vale were nothing more than another piece of furniture in the room. And that silence, that simple unspoken refusal to explain or defend himself, was louder than any confrontation could have been. Richard smirked, convinced he had put another man in his place. To him, this was order restored. Billionaires commanded, staff obeyed. That was the way the world worked, and Richard lived by its rules. He leaned back slightly, relishing the invisible applause he imagined from his entourage. But beneath that surface of arrogance, a ripple of unease stirred. Why hadn't David argued back? Why hadn't he corrected the mistake? David's silence wasn't submission. It was something else, something stronger. And though Richard didn't realize it yet, that nod, the quiet power of it, was the first crack in the empire of certainty he thought he owned. Because sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room is not the one who shouts, but the one who doesn't need to. The room had returned to its quiet hum, but something beneath that hum had shifted. A current, subtle yet undeniable, moved through the space. Conversations resumed, laughter bubbled in corners, but every so often someone's eyes flicked toward the man by the window. The man Richard had just dismissed with a single careless sentence. David Cole stood with his glass of water, watching the city below. His reflection merged with the skyline in the glass, a silhouette carved against towers of steel and glass. There was no sign of offense on his face, no trace of humiliation, only patience. The kind of patience that unsettled people who were always rushing, always clawing for control. Richard, on the other hand, basked in his own performance. He had always believed power was about display, grand gestures, sharp words, reminders of hierarchy. He whispered something to his aide, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The problem with these events," he said, chuckling, "is you can't tell staff from guests." A few nervous laughs followed, forced and brittle. But across the room, the air shifted again. Two men in tailored suits approached David quietly, shaking his hand with genuine warmth. A woman in pearls touched his arm lightly as she greeted him, her smile filled with familiarity. It was subtle, discreet, but it was enough for a few watchful eyes to notice. Richard noticed too. His smirk faltered just for a moment. He leaned toward his publicist. "Who is that man?" he whispered, though his tone was more command than question. She glanced at her notes, then back at David, her brow furrowed. "I'll find out, sir." But before she could move, Richard's attention snapped back. David was jotting something in a worn leather notebook, its edges frayed from use. The pen moved with precision, not idly, like a man recording, calculating, observing. And for the first time, Richard felt the smallest sting of irritation. Staff didn't take notes like that. A group nearby had begun murmuring, their eyes darting between Richard and David. A young executive, clearly uneasy, whispered under his breath, "He handled that well." His colleagues shot him a warning glance as if to say, "Don't get involved." Richard caught the exchange and something in his chest tightened. He despised whispers he wasn't part of. Whispers meant secrets. Secrets meant a shift he couldn't control. Meanwhile, David remained steady, his posture relaxed yet assured. He wasn't trying to command attention, yet attention kept finding him. It was the paradox of quiet strength. The less he demanded, the more the room gave. Richard, refusing to yield, raised his voice slightly so it carried across the polished room. "One day, maybe some of these young men will climb high enough to sit at the table," he said, his tone playful but laced with mockery. "For now, they should just focus on pouring the coffee." A few uneasy chuckles answered him, but not from David. David didn't even turn his head. He simply lifted his glass, took a sip of water, and continued watching the skyline as though Richard Vale's words were nothing more than background noise. And that, his refusal to even acknowledge the insult, was more cutting than any rebuttal could have been. Because in that moment, the silence around David grew louder than Richard's voice. And for the first time that evening, Richard Vale felt the faintest crack of doubt, though he quickly buried it beneath arrogance. What he didn't know, what no one dared tell him yet, was that the man he mocked had already drawn the eyes of the most powerful people in the room. And they weren't laughing with Richard anymore. The dinner service had begun, silver trays gliding in and out of the conference room like clockwork. The clink of glasses and muted conversations filled the space, but for Richard Vale, the evening was no longer moving with ease. He could feel it, the shift, subtle but growing, like a tide creeping higher on the shore. He tried to brush it off. He leaned back in his chair, flashing that trademark grin he'd perfected for decades. He was Richard Vale, billionaire, deal-maker, master of the room. But when his eyes flicked across to David Cole standing by the far end of the table, something unsettled him. The man's presence was quiet, but it carried a weight Richard couldn't explain. And worse, people were noticing. Richard hated being upstaged, even in silence, especially in silence. He decided to press harder. Raising his glass, he spoke loud enough for several tables to hear. "I've always admired the staff who managed to sneak into these events," he said with a smirk. "Takes ambition, doesn't it? Maybe they pick up a thing or two just by being in the room." A few laughed, too quickly, too nervously. The sound didn't carry like it used to. Richard's words were sharp, but they weren't landing the way he expected. Too many eyes darted toward David, too many faces looked away. David didn't flinch. He stood calmly, one hand resting on the back of his chair, the other holding that old leather notebook. His expression was unreadable, his silence deliberate. It wasn't the silence of submission, it was the silence of a man who didn't need to prove himself. Richard noticed that, and it gnawed at him. He leaned toward a younger investor seated nearby. "You see what I mean? Always the same story. Someone eager to look important. But at the end of the day, polish can't hide where a man really belongs." The young investor shifted uncomfortably, mumbling something non-committal before. Excusing himself, he walked straight to David, shaking his hand with respect. That moment landed harder than any rebuttal could have. Richard's grin stiffened, though he masked it with another sip of wine. Across the table, one of the older board members cleared his throat. "Mr. Vale," he said carefully, "perhaps it's best to focus on tonight's agenda." His tone was polite, but the undercurrent was clear. "You're losing the room." Richard waved it off with theatrical charm. Of course, just a little humor to lighten the mood." But the humor wasn't working anymore. The laughter had died. And in that quiet, David Cole became more than just a figure standing in the corner. He became a presence, an anchor the room couldn't ignore. When David finally moved, it was subtle. He closed his notebook, slid it into his jacket, and pulled out a chair at the table. Not at the edge, not tucked away. He sat directly across from Richard Vale. The scrape of the chair against the polished floor felt louder than it should have. Heads turned, conversations paused. Richard's smile faltered as David folded his hands calmly on the table, his posture upright, his gaze steady. For the first time that night, Richard Vale realized something he didn't dare say aloud. This man wasn't staff. And if the weight in the room was any indication, he wasn't just another guest either. The room stilled in an almost imperceptible way when David Cole took his seat at the table. It wasn't announced, it wasn't demanded, yet somehow it carried the weight of a declaration. The scrape of the chair echoed like a gavel striking wood. Every conversation faltered, eyes flicked toward him, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the hum of the city beyond the glass walls. Richard Vale's jaw tightened. He masked it with a smile, the kind of thin grin he used in negotiations when he felt cornered. But inside, irritation clawed at him. How dare this man, this supposed staff, just sit at the table, uninvited? The event host stepped forward, saving Richard from the awkward silence. He raised his glass warmly. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, allow me to acknowledge some of the distinguished leaders with us tonight. His voice carried smoothly, practiced. He gestured to a few known figures around the table, offering nods and applause. Then his eyes settled on David. And a special welcome, he said, pausing as if to emphasize it, to Mr. David Cole. We are honored by your presence this evening. The words hit Richard like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through every assumption he had made. His forced smile froze in place. Around the table, nods of recognition followed. Some guests even leaned toward David with subtle respect, as though his seat at the table had never been in question. David inclined his head slightly, accepting the acknowledgement with quiet grace. No speech, no need for attention, just a calm acknowledgement. But that silence, that refusal to puff his chest or flaunt status, made him stand out even more. Richard cleared his throat, desperate to reassert control. Well, he said with a laugh that sounded thinner than usual, I suppose everyone's welcome at the table these days. The attempt at humor fell flat. Forks clinked again. And plates, glasses shifted, but no laughter came. Only a few nervous smiles. Richard's face burned hot beneath his polished exterior. Then David spoke. His voice was steady, low, and precise, carrying across the table without effort. I find tables are often more revealing than walls, he said. Walls keep people out. Tables show you who's willing to sit together. It wasn't loud. It wasn't confrontational. But the words sliced cleanly through the air. Several heads turned his way, nodding slightly. Richard tried to laugh it off, but his throat felt dry. He reached for his glass, only to realize it was empty. His aide rushed to refill it, but the gesture only emphasized the contrast. Richard scrambling for comfort, David composed in his stillness. The conversation shifted then, but not toward Richard. Attendees began addressing David directly, questions about markets, about strategy, about long-term visions. He responded briefly, never over-explaining, but with the sharp precision of a man who knew far more than he let on. Each word added weight. Each answer drew eyes further away from Richard. And with every passing minute, Richard Vale felt the walls of his dominance shrinking. He had built his empire on the belief that he could read a room, control it with a smirk and a cutting line. But tonight the room wasn't laughing with him. Tonight the room was leaning toward the man he had dismissed with a wave of the hand. The realization struck him like a slow, sinking stone. He was no longer the center. And as he glanced across the table at David Cole, calm, poised, and utterly unbothered, Richard felt the first twinge of something he rarely experienced. Fear. Richard Vale was not a man who surrendered ground easily. For decades, he had built his reputation on sheer dominance, on the ability to bend conversations, negotiations, even entire markets to his will. Tonight would be no different, he told himself. Tonight, he would reclaim the room. He leaned forward, forcing warmth into his smile. Mr. Cole, he said, his voice suddenly softer, almost genial. Allow me to pour you a glass of our best red. It's a rare vintage, very few bottles in existence. He snapped his fingers at a server, who rushed forward with a bottle cradled in white cloth. Richard lifted it high, his grin wide, the gesture grand. David didn't move. He simply placed his palm gently over his glass, shaking his head with quiet politeness. Water is fine, he said. His tone carried no judgment, yet it landed with the finality of a verdict. The server hesitated, eyes darting nervously to Richard. A few guests exchanged glances. It wasn't just a refusal of wine. It was a refusal of performance, of Richard's attempt to reclaim the spotlight. Richard chuckled, though the sound was brittle. A man of discipline, I see. Admirable. He tried to turn it into a compliment, but his voice carried a faint edge. David didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence was beginning to speak louder than Richard's words. Determined, Richard tried again. He launched into a story, one of his favorites, rehearsed for nights like this. He told of a risky deal he had made in London years ago, how he had outmaneuvered rivals and walked away with millions. Normally, the story drew laughs, admiration, even applause. But tonight, it felt hollow. The guests listened politely, but their eyes kept drifting to David, who sat with calm attentiveness, offering no interruption, no forced smile. When Richard finished with his triumphant punchline, the room offered only a smattering of laughter, our polite, restrained, not the roaring approval he was used to. And then, as if by gravity, the conversation shifted. Someone across the table turned to David. "Mr. Cole," the man asked, "what's your perspective on the European markets? We've all been wondering how things will unfold." All at once, the room leaned toward him. David set his glass down, his hands folding loosely on the table. His answer was measured, clear, but never boastful. He spoke of trends, risks, opportunities, his words neither rushed nor embellished. And as he spoke, heads nodded, pens scribbled. Even the most seasoned investors leaned closer, as though trying not to miss a word. Richard sat frozen, his smile stiff, his stomach tightening. He reached for his wine, drinking too quickly, the taste suddenly bitter. He tried to interject once. "Well, that's one way to look at it." But his words fell flat, ignored as others pressed David with more questions. It was happening. The center of gravity was shifting, and Richard was no longer it. Worse, he could feel the whispers rising again, subtle murmurs at the edges of the table. His name no longer carried the same weight in them. The attention, the respect, the subtle admiration, it was moving piece by piece toward David Cole. Richard Vale was a man used to owning the room. Tonight, for the first time, he was losing it. And as he watched David answer yet another question with calm authority, Richard realized something terrifying. He didn't know who this man truly was, but everyone else seemed to. The air inside the glass-walled conference room had shifted entirely. The clink of cutlery, the hum of conversation, the polite laughter, it was all orbiting around one man now, and that man was not Richard Vale. David Cole sat composed at the center of the attention, answering each question with the same quiet precision, his voice carrying authority without ever needing to rise. Every sentence felt deliberate, every pause intentional, as though he were not merely commenting, but shaping the way others would think. Investors leaned forward, pens scratched furiously across notepads, and the host himself seemed almost deferential. Richard Vale sat across from him, burning beneath his polished exterior. He tried to interject, tried to steer the spotlight back with jokes, with anecdotes, with the booming tone he had relied on for decades. But each time, the words fell limp. People nodded politely, then turned back to David as if Richard's voice were background noise. It was unbearable. Richard, who had built empires on commanding attention, was invisible in his own room. Then the host cleared his throat, raising his glass again. The room stilled, all eyes turning his way. Richard straightened, ready for his name to be invoked, his legacy honored, but the words that followed cut through the air like a blade. "Tonight marks a pivotal moment for our partnership discussions," the host announced, "and it is my great honor to formally introduce the man who holds the deciding vote, the man representing a $4 billion investment fund, Mr. David Cole." The words landed like thunder. For a moment, the room was silent, so silent Richard could hear the faint hum of the city outside the glass. Then, applause erupted. Heads turned toward David, faces breaking into admiration, even awe. Several guests rose to their feet, clapping with genuine respect. Richard didn't move, his smile fell off. Rose, his chest tightened, his mind raced, replaying every moment of the evening, every dismissive glance, every cutting remark, every arrogant word he had thrown at the man across from him. Staff. He had called him staff. The humiliation hit like a blow. David didn't bask in the applause. He simply inclined his head in acknowledgement, his calm composure unbroken. He let the noise rise and settle, then lifted his glass of water with a steady hand. "I don't shake hands with men who mistake respect for rank," he said quietly. His words weren't loud, but the silence they created was deafening. They cut deeper than any insult Richard had ever known. The room froze. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others stared openly at Richard, waiting for a response that didn't come. For the first time in his career, Richard Vale was speechless. David set his glass down, unhurried, his gaze never breaking. His silence afterward was its own kind of statement, final, unarguable. And in that silence, the balance of the room shifted completely. Investors who once orbited around Richard now leaned toward David. Conversations reoriented. The empire Richard thought he controlled had, in a single moment, slipped from his grasp. And worst of all, Richard knew it was his own arrogance that had handed it over. The applause faded, but the echo of David Cole's words still hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Richard Vale sat rigid in his chair, his fingers tightening around the stem of his wineglass until it trembled. He forced a smile, but it was the kind of smile that cracked at the edges, brittle and thin. Everyone in the room could see it. The spotlight had shifted and no amount of charm could drag it back. Investors were leaning toward David now, their questions eager, their admiration palpable. Every nod, every handshake, every hushed conversation flowed in his direction. Richard tried once more, a desperate attempt to salvage dignity. He leaned across the table, his voice pitched louder than necessary. "Mr. Cole, I must say, you've surprised me tonight. I didn't realize." His words faltered. The end of the sentence hung unfinished, suffocated by its own insincerity. David didn't respond. He didn't need to. He simply looked at Richard for a moment, his calm gaze steady, unflinching. It wasn't anger in his eyes, nor was it triumph. It was something sharper, clarity, the kind of clarity that stripped away Richard's layers of arrogance and exposed the emptiness beneath. One of the older investors spoke then, his tone reverent. "Mr. Cole, your insights are invaluable. I believe we've all seen tonight the kind of leadership this partnership requires." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Chairs shifted. Several guests stood, shaking David's hand with genuine respect. The kind of respect Richard had once commanded effortlessly, but no longer. Richard's throat tightened. He raised his glass again, but no one mirrored the gesture. He was holding a toast to himself, alone. David finished the last of his water, set the glass down, and rose smoothly to his feet. He buttoned his jacket with deliberate calm, nodded once to the host, and turned toward the glass doors. His steps were unhurried, confident. He didn't need to linger. He had already claimed the room without raising his voice, without demanding attention. Richard watched him go, his chest hollow. The man he had dismissed as staff had walked out not just with the respect of every person in the room, but with the future of billions under his command. And Richard was left with nothing but the bitter taste of humiliation. As the doors closed behind David, silence fell for a moment. Then conversations resumed. Only now, Richard was no longer at the center. His empire, built on arrogance and fear, had cracked. Not because of an enemy's attack, not because of betrayal, but because of his own blindness. That night, as the city lights flickered against the glass walls, Richard Vale finally understood a truth he had spent a lifetime ignoring. Power is not measured by wealth or status. It is measured by presence. And David Cole had it in a way Richard never would.